All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of the TimePod. Today I have a guest with me, namely Johan Westin, and we are going to talk about Egypt, and we're going to talk specifically about Ahkenaten and Nefertiti, two really important figures in Egyptology, I would say. We will also go through a little bit of Egypt in general and the different time periods that we're talking about in order to put everything of this into context. So, and with no further ado, I would like to present my guest, or well, he can present himself. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Johan, or Mr. Moth on Twitter, if you want to give me a follow. I study history, among other things. I'm studying to become a teacher. And I am excited to join Tardulf here today for this time pod on Ahkenaten and Nefertiti.
All right. Where should we really start? The Egyptians, or well, the ancient times overall. All the dates we're going to talk about today is before Christ, basically, so before our time.
Yes.
So it's not, we're not talking about 1300s, you know, like we're talking about the 1300s before Jesus was allegedly born. So yeah, Egypt, really interesting place overall, a long-lasting society, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about Egypt, basically most of history starts when Egypt is finished. Like if you think of the ancient Greeks, if you think of the Roman Empire, a lot of Chinese empires as well. When Egyptian civilization basically you're almost already done with the classical period before you start.
Yeah, and Egypt is we usually talk about Egypt in the sense of I would say like it's a little bit of an isolated thing. When you talk about Egypt, you talk specifically about Egypt, maybe not so much about the world as it was back then when the Egyptians were about. So you basically, the history of writing is basically very, what do you call it, Egyptocentric when it comes to this period, because we don't have a lot of else to go on.
Yeah, because they had neighbors and there were, people living outside there, but they had writing, and a lot of other people maybe didn't have a writing system. So we know more about them.
Yeah, and Egypt is the one civilization that basically also survived the Bronze Age collapse.
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
It's the only one that did that, I think. What we know of, I should say.
Yeah. There were troubles, but yeah.
Yeah, they eventually prevailed. And Egypt is one thing people should know about Egypt is that Egypt is basically you're talking about three different time periods. Talking about three different kingdoms, not dynasties. Basically, you have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom.
Yeah. So if you think Old Kingdom, that's the time period where the pyramids are all built, most of them at least.
Yeah.
The really famous ones at Giza, for example.
Yeah. And you had the Middle Period. They also built pyramids, I think. Not in the same. Not as big ones.
Yeah, I think those are usually a little smaller as well, and not as well known.
Yeah, and
but yeah,
and then you have the New Kingdom, which is they didn't build the pyramids, and the story about Akhenaten and Nefertiti would be placed in the New Kingdom.
Here. Yes.
Yeah. So, how would you describe the religion of the Egyptians?
Yeah. So the Egyptians had a polytheistic religion. So they had many different gods.
Yeah.
And the gods were almost like nature gods, but they were not, but they were also like individual gods. So you have the most famous ones, the sun god Ra, or Amun as well.
Yeah, he would become Amun.
Those sort of two sort of combined.
Yeah, he would become Amun Ra later. I think if I read in a history of world societies, I think you have a period when Ra and Amun were different, but then they were merged. Something like that. But yeah.
Yeah. So they're really old versions there too. Yeah.
Yeah. And
then you have also other gods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have you also have the system
like.
Yeah. Continue.
Yeah, you have other gods like Horus and Isis, who have sort of other roles. And there were a lot of other gods as well. Anubis, probably some of you may know.
Yeah. We also had Noon, I think, that is basically the creator of the world. Egyptians had an idea that the world was basically created from a lotus flower in a sea of emptiness. I think that depiction is in the Temple of Dendera. I think I'm not really sure there, but internet is not the best place to look for archaeological evidence on things. But yeah. So yeah, the religious part is obviously gonna play a big part when we are talking about Ahkenaten and Nefertiti later. So yeah, what was the let's say, how would you say was Egypt that successful in becoming prosperous? Do you have any thoughts of it?
Yeah, well, one pretty obvious thing is the Nile, which even today almost the entire population of Egypt live around the Nile, in the river area, because that's the most fertile area for growing crops and such. And that also had a big role in not only Egyptian society, but in Egyptian religion as well, because also the Nile is very regular in its flooding, so you can use it much more simply to grow crops rather than other rivers which are more unpredictable.
Yeah, like you have the Euphrates and Tigris, both are, I think, more irregular than the Nile.
Yeah, very much so.
Which is, those rivers were also essential for the Mesopotamian societies in the beginning. So basically, you could say that both Egypt and the Mesopotamian societies flourished because they were placed where there were a lot of water.
Yeah, and that also goes for there was already early Chinese civilization as well, had the Yellow River.
Oh yeah.
And also Indian civilization had the Indus.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's a kind of a reoccurring theme when we're talking about ancient history. There is a reason why we find the ancient societies where we find them. Usually it's water. I would say almost always water.
Yeah, I mean, even today, most big cities are either at rivers or at the coast, or sometimes at a very big lake.
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to your Egypt, there is a little bit lacking of sources on a lot of things. We know a lot of things thanks to their hieroglyphs that they put in temples and stuff like that. And we know some because we have found a lot of the mummies and stuff, but we haven't found everything. So there are a lot of gaps.
Yes, and when we come to Akhenaten, those gaps are sort of especially big, because a thing that happened a lot, not only in Egypt, but in other places as well, is when a king died and the people that followed after didn't really like them. They tended to destroy the evidence that they existed. So a lot of records and a lot of statues are destroyed.
Which makes it even more amazing that we know what we know about Akhenaten, because this guy was really hated.
Yeah, he kind of stands out.
he stands out a little bit. He stands out so much that he's mentioned in this book, which is speaking volumes, considering that this book is, the entire world history. But basically, in Egypt was I wouldn't say that during this time, you didn't have a lot of war for conquering places. Not in the same way as the Romans would later do.
Yeah, especially in the new, especially in the old and middle kingdoms. Yeah. There was a little more war in the new kingdom with the Hittites and things like that.
Yeah.
But mostly they just kept around the Nile because, that was their strong area.
Yeah, exactly. I would say I would say that there wasn't as many expansionary wars as humans would later do with Alexander the Great and stuff like that. Usually it was about defending your resources. And in Egypt, Egypt and Mesopotamia were kind of dependent on each other during these times, because they had various resources in various, I would say kingdoms. So trade was basically essential, and it was not a good idea to kill the ones you traded with unless there was a really good reason for it.
Yeah, and the Egyptians had a lot of food, which is very, very essential.
Yeah, and the other people had, copper and tin, which
you need for bronze creation.
Yeah, which is why we call it the Bronze Age, basically.
Yes.
Bronze was the new hype thing to use. And while we're talking about Egypt as a whole, I kind of want to talk about. I'm guessing that people that are listening to this might wonder about, the toolworks of Egypt and how you could cut things and cut stone and stuff for the pyramids. There is a lot of conspiracy theories out there about how these things were built. So I kind of feel like we can do a little bit of a public service annunciation here about that. And when Egypt built the pyramids and cut the stones, they worked with copper mostly. Bronze is expensive. And you tried to do most of the pyramids are cut in sandstones, which copper works pretty good for, since it's so soft. Both materials are pretty soft. You also used the sand in the deserts basically as saw teeth. So you didn't have, how a saw looks today. A saw has teeth, right? But the Egyptian saws didn't have that, but they used the grains of sand instead as the teeth to cut the stones. And they used sleds to transport the stones from the quarries. We know that because we have a hieroglyph for sled. And they also used water to break the stones off, because you put in small wooden pieces in your cuts of the stone, and then you use water. The wooden material expands and breaks off the stone from the quarry. That's usually how we think they did it. So forget about toolboxes with laser guns or levitation or whatever. These guys did it for real, and
yeah. And I think one thing you can add as well is that when we think of these workers and we think of Egypt, we maybe think of slaves. But actually, there is a lot of evidence to show that the workers were actually very, very professional, and they had a lot of they had quite a standing. They were not, low-grade workers, but they were professional builders.
Yeah, which kind of makes sense, because when you're undertaking such projects, you kind of need, professionals to do it. I don't think that a slave would, care that much. But also, I want to add, when it comes to the pyramid, there is a new theory about how you got the pyramid's sides aligned, and it's basically that you built the pyramid from inside out instead of, you didn't build the outside of the pyramid first, but you build the insides of it, and then you progressed upwards. This is a theory put forward by some architects, but I think it's worth mentioning. That's how you don't get, the angles wrong. That's the only way to do it, actually, I think. Because, if you put the angles wrong in the bottom of the pyramid, otherwise, on the outside of the pyramid, the top would be, not where it should be. I think that this type of engineering is really interesting to bring up, because usually when you talk ancient societies, it's easy to forget how humans are actually capable of this kind of things, even 3,000 years ago. It's just amazing to me that.
Yeah. And one other interesting thing I found about, for example, the Great Pyramid of Giza, when that was built, there were still, in some parts of Northern Europe, there were still woolly mammoths.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was Asia, but there were still woolly mammoths at the same time as these people were building the giant pyramid.
Which talks about how, I mean, the time frame we are talking about is insane. Like, you can't, like, that would be, the pyramids are estimated to be built during the Old Kingdom, and that is approximately 2,600 years BCE, which would make them a little bit over 4,000 years old.
Yeah,
which is an insane amount of time. And I think that sometimes people kind of forget that when they read about this, like how absurdly long this is. It's
you might think like, okay, we have Egypt, and then we have a little time, and then we have the Romans, but actually no, it's more like 1 millennium or something like that.
Yeah,
or a few millennia.
And that's kind of fun, because when you're talking about Rome, you also have the idea of, that is also a very long time that Rome existed. So you have So when you're talking about Rome, and people, let's say like people like Stefan Molyneux makes their takes on why Rome fell, they usually have no problem jumping 500 years back and forth, which I take a big issue with, because you can't blame something that was decided 500 years ago caused the fall of the empire. Like, so when we are talking about these time periods, we do jump a lot, but it's also very important that you don't jump to conclusions in that sense. And that even goes for Egypt. Like the categorization that we have for Egypt, for example, like we had the Old, the Middle, and New Kingdom, that is just to make it understandable for us when we read about it. So they has split it up just so that we know what period of time we're talking about.
And even then you still have what's called intermediary periods. Which we don't really know that much about.
Yeah, exactly, because these time periods aren't lining up perfectly either, always. So
yeah,
and the reason historians and archaeologists do this kind of categorization is obviously because this is what we got evidence for, and this is a united culture under that time period that we can put together and see, so we can understand that one culture that was going on during that time. So historians and archaeologists have basically decided that we have three different cultures to follow, and that's why we have different segments of the Egyptian history, because it differ a bit. As you said, most pyramids were built in the Old Kingdom, and the New Kingdom barely built. I don't think they built pyramids even. So
yeah, they've built temples.
Yeah.
I think they're more famous for building. And as you know, maybe, for example, Tutankhamun was not buried in a pyramid. He was buried.
He was buried in the Valley of Kings. Was he?
Yeah,
he was.
I think that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just that his grave was a little bit hidden.
And Tutankhamun is from the New Kingdom.
Yeah. All right, so while we're on it, let's move on a little bit to Akhenaten. What do we know about him?
Well, as we said, his childhood isn't really that well known. But we know that he wasn't called Akhenaten when he was born.
Yeah.
He was called Amenhotep or Amenhotep the fourth.
Yeah.
And his father was called Amenhotep the third. And this basically means, so Amen is the sun god Amen. So it's to honor that god that we're called Amenhotep.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. Yeah. Akhenaten was a taken name that he took later on when he became pharaoh. So we don't know. And the thing with this story is that we know even less about his wife. We know who she was. Like, we know that she was his wife. We know, but we don't even know when she died.
No.
There are some historians that propose that she outlived him, but there are also some historians that propose that she died before it. We can't make any really sure assumptions on that matter. The only thing we have really of her is that the famous bust that is in Germany. It's a very famous bust. I probably put a link to a picture of it. It is pictured in the thumbnail of this episode. But yeah, and and for Akhenaten and for Nefertiti, we don't have their tombs. So that is also why a lot of information is missing, because we can't. Continue.
And that is true for basically all the pharaohs except for Tutankhamun. That we maybe have found their tombs, but they were empty, or we didn't find the mummy, or because a lot of these tombs were not found by archaeologists the way we found Tutankhamun's.
We're gonna talk a little bit about the founding of Tutankhamun's tomb later, and why that's a disgrace on its own. But basically, archaeology during this time, when Egyptology became popular, wasn't really professional. We have no idea how much they destroyed. By doing the way they did. Well, Akhenaten, he becomes pharaoh after Amenhotep the third.
Yeah.
And Akhenaten was born, we think, 1351 before Christ, or before our time. What made Akhenaten such a character to you?
Well, Akhenaten, he compared to the other kings, he was people found him quite weird, especially because he, you were supposed to to follow in the footsteps, of your father. You were supposed to keep the Egyptian traditions going. You were not supposed to really change society that much, because Egypt lasted so long time. A lot of these traditions were very much, things changed quite slowly. But he wanted them to change fast.
Really fucking fast.
Yeah.
It's absurd how fast this period. Like, we're talking about a time period that is roughly 3,000 years, but now we're talking about a human lifetime of just massive changes, which is absurd for a culture. I don't know if there is any part of human history that even compares to this, really.
No. One of the first things he changed, as you might have guessed, is his name. He changed it from Amenhotep to Akhenaten.
Yeah.
Which and he changed from one god, Amun, to change his name to celebrate another god called Aten. And you might not think this is very weird in a sort of polytheistic society, but it was very, very extraordinary to take a step like that.
Yeah, isn't it also that he himself created Aten? Because, well, we think that. I wouldn't be entirely sure.
There are some people who would say, I think, that Aten was a very small god. He was like a very, very, very minor god. But he existed. Like in Hinduism, you have very, very many gods. And you have that in Egypt too. In a lot of places, maybe just one god was worshipped in one town or something like that.
Yeah, it can, in that sense, it kind of, just to throw in a medieval reference, it kind of reminds you of how certain saints had certain cults in certain cities. Like, they still believe in the same, religion, but they worship a certain saint.
But, for all intents and purposes, Aten didn't really exist as something that people worshipped, like the everyday Egyptian. Yeah.
And basically, one point out, Aten is a sun god. So basically, he when Akhenaten decided that this is the god we're gonna follow, he basically kicked out Amun-Ra and told him to fuck off somewhere else, because this is the real sun god. And Aten is the literal sun, like he's a sun disk, according to the hieroglyphs and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you can also see that on the thumbnail, I think.
Yeah.
We have the symbol of Aten, which is a sun and like arrows out from it.
Yeah, that's basically how he's portrayed. Akhenaten decided that I would say that all the other gods were garbage, and that Aten was the one to follow.
Yeah. Some people actually say that this is like the first monotheistic religion, because it was basically just one god.
Yeah. I'm gonna use the Swedish history pod for this argument that that is an idea, but basically we don't really have the evidence for it, and we know that people still worship the other gods during this time.
So that is, I also agree that that's probably not the best explanation. There is another word called monolatric, I think.
All right.
You can call a religion monolatric, which is you believe there are other gods, but you only worship one.
Yeah, I would say that during Akhenaten's reign, I would say that would be more fitting explanation to it.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Because basically what he did, he yeeted out all the other gods. He said that Adam is the one true God, and then he did something else, and that was like we're gonna move the capital.
Yes.
And this is I'm gonna say that this is a interestingly stupid decision, because what he wants to do is to move the capital from the Nile and into the desert, because the desert is where the sun is, or something like that.
He also predictably names the new city he wants to move it to Akhenaten. After himself.
Wow, who could have guessed? It's almost like this is some kind of weird ego trip.
Almost.
I really like it though. The kind of balls you need to have to just, nope, we're not doing this anymore. We're doing this. Oh, okay. You should also know that the priests of the old religion were really happy about this.
Yeah, even if the pharaoh was the one in charge, he still had other people that had to be along for the ride, so to speak. He needed helpers. Yeah, and a lot of the people that basically were the Amun-Ra priesthood, they were not happy at all.
Yeah, so that would build up a pretty good base of enemies right there.
Yes.
We do know that Nefertiti did support him in this. She did from the writings, it doesn't seem like she opposed it at all that much. Of course, we don't know what she really said, but it seems like she was along for the ride.
Nefertiti was also maybe one of the more prominent sort of pharaoh's wives, even in ruling, because there is still some suggestion that she was not co-ruler, but she sort of influenced a bit as well.
Yeah, Nefertiti has, I would say, she has the same, what would I say? The same, almost like the same presence, like Cleopatra, but we know much less about her. Which is sad. I would like to know more about her as a person, of course, but because she seems to have been really important during the time of these events. So, I think she was a real character.
Yeah, and especially if you look at history generally, a lot of women have been sort of written out of it, and that's sort of to an extreme level what you have in Egyptian history. Because you basically only know about the pharaohs, and even then you know quite little. And there was only I think one or possibly two female pharaohs, and I don't think Nefertiti counts as one of them.
No, I don't think she does either. We know she probably outlived Akhenaten, as I said earlier, but we don't know her actual death, and that's probably because she wasn't buried as a pharaoh. Otherwise, we would know a lot more about it. But the thing with when Akhenaten dies, he dies in 1334, we think. There's a lot we think in this episode. that's still, we should mention that is still about 600 or 700 years before the Romans start to do their thing. I mean, I can't stress enough how far off this is in time.
And this is still almost like, it's not the end of Egyptian civilization, but it's sort of getting there.
Yeah, it's it's on a decline. And his religion was basically weird because, as we said, he followed the sun god Aton, and he was kind of, as we understand it from the scripts or whatever, it kind of uncompromising on that as well. That this was the deal. This is the new god that we're gonna follow. And but it's almost like he tried to remove polytheistics from the Egyptian society or civilization.
Yeah, and that's, if you think about, ancient kings or ancient rulers, you often think of them like, do they really believe in the religion? Yeah. Like, for example, in your last episode, you went through the history of Gustav Vasa, and he had the Reformation in Sweden, and the sort of analysis of that is that it's mostly, it was mostly because he wanted maybe less power to the church and more power to the state.
Yeah.
But this guy kind of seems like he actually believes in himself, or at least believes really hard in the religion.
Yeah, there is the difference between him and Gustav in that sense. Because Gustav was clearly a very cynical person, which makes it really easy to, determine where he stood on the matter. It was much easier to rob the church if you were Protestant than it was to rob it if you were Catholic. So basically, it was basically just a big robbing scheme. That's how I see it. But in this case, it wasn't really, because you have, as we mentioned before, when you move the capital city like that, which can look, if you just read about it, it looks like a goddamn suicide mission.
Yeah, I mean, even if he was like cynical and was trying to manipulate him, that's like the wrong move, because you just make a whole lot of enemies and you make no friends.
Yeah, because the move of the capital only creates problems, because that capital cannot survive on its own. It's impossible where it's played. I think we have found it.
It's it's in a place called that's today called Amarna.
Yeah.
Or Amarna. So sometimes archaeologists especially call the sort of period around Akhenaten, they call it the Amarna period.
Yeah. Yeah, because the move itself was basically, if you built a city in that place, it wouldn't survive on its own. That's impossible. It's literally impossible.
As we said, the Nile was basically created all the food for Egypt.
Yeah, and he just like, no, let's move into the desert, because that is where the sun is. Food, I don't know.
Yeah.
Transport it or whatever.
And as we kind of mentioned earlier as well, the Nile was kind of almost religious as well. It was like I think there was a god for the Nile. I don't know his name, but they also kind of viewed the sort of the water from the Nile as a god, and sort of moving away from that would be not looked upon kindly.
Yeah, exactly, and that doesn't only go for the priest. That goes for everyone.
Yeah.
I also want to mention. I mentioned in the beginning of the episode. I mentioned that the Egyptians believed that the world was created from a sea of nothingness, and if I remember correctly now, I'm gonna say that this is a little bit of a guess on me because I couldn't find a source on it, but that the Sea of Nothingness probably is the Nile that they are referring to. It was a lotus flower in the Nile that birthed the Egyptian society. And if you remove the Nile and just go on your own venture like Akhenaten did, that's gonna create some tension. People did follow, though. You know, you're born in a society in which the pharaoh is very important.
Yeah, the pharaoh is basically almost, as we said, who was, you know, the son of the gods, basically.
Yeah, I can put in here that pharaoh basically means great house, or, you know, the great house, or something like that. So it's the greatest house, so to speak, if I understand my sources correctly. And so people weren't really, you know, during this time, people weren't really, let's fight for liberalism or something like that. It was more like, no, we're gonna follow our king. He has the word from the gods, and we're gonna follow that. So people followed Akhenaten into this, as I still call it, a suicide mission in building the city. But that city also was abandoned as soon as it died. People just, nope, we don't care.
Yeah, because there basically was no major support for the Aten religion among, you know, most people. He had a very, very few people that were strong believers. So when he went away, you know, there was no one to carry it on.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. You lead a country in this kind of cultural change without any followers. And you kind of, I wouldn't say succeed, but you kind of make it. You know, you kind of make that change. But no one is believing in it. And I'm kind of surprised that this didn't cause a riot of some sort, because if we learn from history otherwise, anything like this would be a call for civil war in other societies, which were like, all right, we put up with this bullshit or something like that. I don't know. Continue. It would be such let's say, I would love to have more sources written by regular people from the time as their thought process.
Yeah. It could, what was that? I lost my train of thought there.
That's fine.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk a little bit about his death and his son, but I also want to bring up how the Egyptians viewed death.
Yes.
So we are talking about a culture that, much like Christianity, believes in an eternal afterlife. So they have we have these death scrolls. Do you know anything about those?
No, not that much.
No?
I know more about the more general view of death.
Yeah, okay. So the death scrolls, anyways, were a couple of scrolls that you put in the graves of pharaohs and stuff like that, because that was basically guidelines on how they were to go on to the afterlife, because the afterlife wasn't just, you die and go there. It was a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
Because,
and they view the afterlife kind of not like you go someplace that's not Earth, but they sort of viewed it more like in some sense a kind of practically, like you will need physical things in your afterlife.
Yeah. And the Death Scrolls were basically, as I understand it, because I take this from the BBC podcast In Our Time, they had some Egyptologists on there. So I will probably link that episode in the sources. But they're talking about that the scrolls are basically instructions, right? How do you transcend to your eternal life? One of the biggest parts of it, as I could get, is that your heart, the lighter weight on your heart, the better. So basically, if you are free of sin, your heart will weigh like a feather. That will grant you a passage to the afterlife, right? So basically, the last step of this thing is that I think it's Ammon. Who is it? Is it Anubis that weights the heart?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna say I'm a little bit unsure on this.
Anubis is often associated with death, I think.
Yeah.
So
he weights.
It could be him, yeah.
Yeah. So he weights the heart, and the lighter your heart is, the better you're gonna have it, in the afterlife. And that's also why the tombs were filled with treasures and stuff like that. It was because you're gonna need those treasures in your afterlife, right? So, but that's kind of funny with the mummies, is that all of them still have their hearts because they still need to weigh them. All other organs were taken out. They even took out the brain. And do you know how they did that?
Yes, they... okay, so beware for some gruesome stuff. They inserted like a stick or something like that in the nose, and they put it like through to the brain, and he sort of mushed it up a bit, and then they pulled it out through the nose.
It's amazing. I love it.
Yeah.
It's so...
it's very horror.
It's so grotesque. It's beautiful, almost.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically all other organs were taken out. The reason I'm gonna go on the loop here and make my own little theory here, is that I don't think that this was done to Akhenaten or Nefertiti. I think they were kind of just left there to die.
Yeah, they weren't, as we know, they weren't very popular after their life, so that's very possible.
I'm not saying that we would have found his tomb, but I'm also saying that we would have found his tomb.
Yeah. I want to add one thing that I think is very interesting about sort of Egypt. We often think about sort of mummies as being, these great, the pharaohs, which of course they had the fanciest mummies, but they also used embalming on like ordinary people.
Yeah.
Because they had the same idea. They didn't have pyramids, but they still, conserved the body and things like that.
Yeah,
so that they could go.
Haven't we found a lot of those in the deserts? Because they were buried in the deserts, not in tombs.
Yeah, so a lot of them are in the desert.
Obviously these rules of, the passage to the eternal life goes for everyone, not just the pharaohs. But so they would apply this to everyone, basically.
Yeah, and there's even, I think, because this sort of Egyptian culture lived on so long, even up until Roman times, there were like Egyptian Roman soldiers in Britain guarding like Hadrian's Wall, being buried with this same sort of style.
Yeah. So we are. I understand that we haven't talked that much about Akhenaten as a person, more of the concept in this episode, which is what you have to do, because we don't have that much on him.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's very important to understand that even though Akhenaten is just, a figurehead during this time period is kind of also important for later historical events and the future Egypt. One historian in the BBC podcast In Our Time, again, also claims that this is basically Akhenaten's reign is basically a proof that of an instability in the ancient Egyptian society, which leads to the decline that will eventually happen. Because you can't, if the society is stable, you can't do this kind of overthrow that he does.
Yeah. This is sort of, one of the reasons this is very well, or people tend to react when they see it, is that it doesn't happen over and over again in a lot of big empires, that someone just, changes the religion completely just because he thought so.
Yeah, it's kind of a cultural revolution that didn't have a lot of followers. So I don't know.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it was an actual revolution or more of a, I don't know, some kind of personal rebellion.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting because when we're talking about Ahkenaten and Nefertiti, we're not talking about the end of the Egyptian Empire still, but it will eventually come to an end, and it will come to an end during the Roman period. Well, that's the definite end of it. I would say it would be Marcus Antony and Cleopatra's love affair and all of that stuff.
Yeah,
which is basically
There were some, the Ptolemaic dynasty, even if they were kind of Greek as well after Alexander the Great, they still call themselves pharaohs and tried to be sort of integrate into the old Egyptian way.
Yeah. So basically what you have is a culture that people want to preserve, but it can't really preserve itself. It's going to die. It's just, and you have, and as I said, it basically ends with Cleopatra and Marcus Antony and that kind of stuff, which is a whole other story, by the way. But that's the thing with history. It's so difficult to stay on one topic when you're talking about it. But also, Egypt lasted for well about, I would say, 2,000 years or something like that.
Or if you're counting all the way to Cleopatra, it's more maybe 3,000 years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's even more if we go that far. And it's an impressive culture. So when the archaeological finds started to happening during the 1700s and the 1800s, it's not weird to think of it as it must have been kind of exciting for the people that found it or found the sites. It's just
especially because,
continue.
Especially because they knew so little about because they couldn't read the hieroglyphs. They didn't have any stories of the people that built it, like we do a little bit more now, at least. They didn't, and they couldn't sort of interpret everything in the way we can do now.
Yeah, and I think we should mention that the reason that we can interpret ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs is because of the so-called Rosetta Stone. That was basically deciphered during the 1800s, I think.
18 or late 1700s. Maybe.
Yeah. I'm not sure about the dates. So I'm not gonna drop one. Basically, that stone had 3 languages, but it wrote the same message in all three languages. So that's basically, so it's like a puzzle, and when you could translate the messages between each other, you could understand the language that the hieroglyphs were. And that's basically why we know so much today.
Yeah, I think it was Greek, and it was sort of the everyday language of Egypt, and then you had the hieroglyphs as well.
Yeah, something like that. And we're going to talk, finally, we're going to talk a little bit about Tutankhamun, because you can't talk about Egypt without mentioning that boy's name. As a ruler, insignificant. He doesn't really matter. What he did was, after his father Akhenaten died, he became the ruler, and he restored the religion to before Aton, basically.
Yes,
I think.
And one sign of that could be that when he was born, he was actually called by his father Tutankhaten. So he also had the name Aten.
Yeah.
But he changed it back to Amon.
Yeah. So we don't know why he did it, but probably some peer pressure.
Yeah, he was very, very young when he sort of became the pharaoh.
Yeah. But as a ruler, he was, as I said, kind of insignificant. He didn't do much else, and he died young. Probably from he probably fell off a chariot or something like that.
He was also kind of deceased, we think.
Yeah. He was disease-ridden. We should also mention that Egyptians didn't really have a problem with incest, so a lot of those things were going on.
That's common for a lot of royal families that want to keep the power close. They don't want to marry away their power, so to speak.
We call it the Habsburg style, but we should really call it the Egyptian style because they started it.
Yeah, they were the originals, yeah.
And that's also a thing that is brought up a lot. I think I'm gonna link a picture in the description to Akhenaten's appearance, because it's very different, which have made some historians claim that he is also a result of an incestuous relationship. He looks very different from the other pharaohs.
Yeah, you can instantly see when it's Akhenaten and when it's someone else. He has very distinct face.
Yeah, but when it comes to the excavation of Tutankhamun's grave, that is a mess. I mean, they found the grave, they dynamited themselves into it. Just that alone is just, what the fuck, dudes? But it was already plundered, right? It was, you had a lot of treasures, but not that many treasures. We also know that he is in a tomb that was probably not designed for him. Some Egyptologists argue that it might be a tomb designed for Nefertiti, but that would require her to still being alive.
Yeah. So, this really sort of also shows that the reason really we know that much about, or we know the name Tutankhamun, is kind of an accident, because we have the big fancy mummy with the sort of gold mask, which is a really cool image, and we don't really have that for many other pharaohs.
Yeah, and before we conclude this episode, I just want to tell everyone that when they were excavating him, they tried to remove the mask, which damaged his face badly. It's just like that. I can tell you like that. If we were gonna do it like that today, it would be desecration. It's everything about the excavation is horrible. It's just
a lot of sort of old archaeology is very, very, very careless, and especially also if you think that it's often sort of colonial people who do the excavations.
Yeah.
And so it's mostly, I think it was mostly British and French in Egypt.
Yeah.
So they didn't think it was like, okay, this is some other place. We don't really have to be that careful with it.
Yeah. That's kind of. I also want to, before we end the episode, I also want to talk a little bit about that you can't do excavations today, right now, at least. And the Egyptian authorities are really trying to preserve this heritage, so to speak.
Yeah. And, you can kind of understand that, because a lot of time when, people went to Egypt before, they didn't okay, we're borrowing this and taking it to Britain or to France. They just took it.
Yeah, it's, the British Museum, it wouldn't be a lot of a museum if they didn't steal all that shit.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I was at a small museum actually in Newcastle in Great Britain.
Yeah.
And I was just watching around, and it's a kind of a small place, and it isn't really that much stuff. But then you just turn the corner, and there's a mummy, because they borrowed it from the British Museum, and they have all that stuff.
Yeah, which really should be in Egypt. I think. You also have the Nefertiti bust that is in Berlin, Germany.
Yeah, the Ahkenaten Museum, I think it's called.
Yeah. So I understand that as well. That
you have kind of a weird situation with sort of the Egyptians borrowing stuff from the British Museum to have it in Egypt.
Yeah, it's it's a kind of a fucked situation. It's like it's like Sweden has a lot of stuff from the 30-year wars that we for some reason just refuse to return. But yeah, especially from the sacking of Prague, we have a lot. But it looks like that's how it's gonna be. And if you listen to this episode and you think you didn't talk that much about Akhenaten, I can only say that we talked about as much as there is and what he did, because that is the most important part. We don't know a whole lot more. But if you know something else, just comment or send me a tweet or something like that. Just tell me, because I would love to hear it.
Yeah, me as well.
Yeah,
I think one thing we should think about when we think about these big characters is that a lot of the stuff with Akhenaten, for example, it evolved a lot of people around him. Even if he personally had a very big impact, it's still a lot of the things are still the societal changes are still very big, even if we don't know that much about him as a person. We know sort of the impact of what he did.
Yeah, so the conclusion to this episode would be Akhenaten was weird, everything changed, and then he changed back, and then everything collapsed. Now we're talking about a few hundred years, but still. But I think basically we have concluded the story of Ahkenaten and Nefertiti. I would have loved to know more about Nefertiti as well, as I mentioned before. But we don't know that much. We know that she was a prominent supporter of her husband, and that is why basically she's mentioned. We know that the Egyptian tried to destroy the evidence of their existence, but failed. And we know that this is, late Egyptian society, which would later fail, and stuff like that. I think we have gone through a lot of years, a lot of thousand years, in a very compromised way. There is a lot more. There is a lot more to read about this. You could read, for example, my study book, "A History of World Societies," is a really good source for reading about this. It's not too deep about Egypt, but it has some pretty good sources. And you have read a book called Akhenaten, which you claimed before the cast is basically more about the archaeology.
It's about like it has some of the history, which is where I looked it up, but it also has some about it's basically called Images, History, Fantasy, and Ancient Egypt. So it has a little more stuff about some stuff about the archaeology, some stuff about the religion. So it's kind of it's like academic level. So if you really want to dig into it, you might find it.
Yeah, and I would suggest that if you want something about Egypt or something like that, I would suggest that you make sure that the person you are reading is an actual Egyptologist, because when it comes to this time period, there is a lot of bad books. So make sure you're reading people that actually know something.
Yeah, in the book I read, one of the authors pointed that out as well, that when you have so few sources, people tend to let their fantasies run amok and just sort of invent, okay, this person was like this, even if we don't really know.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to warn, when it comes to Egypt especially, that is really prominent. You can go on YouTube and find a lot of Egypt, but it's mostly just bullshit. And it's really important to be critical of your sources here. Especially when it comes to things like about Egypt society, or most YouTube videos will probably focus on how the pyramids were built. For that, I would suggest a video called Ancient Aliens Debunked, which has a really good section on how the pyramids were built. That is a really good source for that if you're curious. For the rest of Egypt, I would go look for Egyptologists and put my faith in them, because I don't even think that just regular historians would do. So even in this podcast, we are two historians sitting here discussing this, but fact check us. Just go to any Egyptologist and make sure that what we are saying in this podcast is true. And if you find something that we have said that isn't true, just tweet me or email me or contact me in any way. I will correct that, and I will make sure that that information comes out. We are doing this for fun, so so there might be some wrongs here and there. We don't work with it, And I think that would be the end of the episode. Is there anything you want to plug? Do you have any projects?
No. I'm just a history student. I don't do any podcast other than this one. This was my first one.
Yeah.
So I thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah.
If you wanna hit me up or talk about anything, I'm on Twitter. Have the handle Mr. Moth.
I will leave a link in the description for that so that you can find him.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to talk to. And
Yeah.
I will thank you for this talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll keep listening to your episodes. They're very interesting. And you should as well, as the listener.
Yeah, I'm doing my best. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I will see you guys next time. And until that, which probably is a few weeks away, because I'm gonna do some history studying and examinations. So until that, have a good one.
Have a good one.